everyone. I'm sure we're not yet at a full audience, but trying to establish a rule that says we'll start roughly on time. So welcome to what we expect is going to be the first of a series of 4 debates. You obviously know about the first one, that's why you're here. There are going to be another 3, roughly spread a month apart between now and November. So I should introduce myself. I'm Norman Gemmell. I'm the Chair in Public Finance at Victoria University. And since this is a joint venture between ourselves and the Government Economics Network, Girol Karachalou, who's sat at the front here, he's a co-chair and co-sponsor of this set of debates. We're calling them debates. It might actually be more appropriate to think of this as trying to ape a court of law, or at least the kind that I've seen on film. I don't think I've ever actually spent time in a court of law on any side of the dock, as it were. In the sense that what we're going to try and present to you today and in subsequent debates is akin to presenting you with a case for the defence, a case for the prosecution, a summing up for the jury, as it were, by the commentator, and then inviting you, in a sense, to tell us how persuaded you are by the various arguments. Why have we organised these debates? It's rather different from the usual academic approach, which is to look for the best evidence in support of an argument, to look at the relevant theory and decide what does theory say we should expect, what does the evidence do to back up that theory. What we're trying to do here, in a sense, is to say, in a whole area of public policy discussions, reasonable people can legitimately hold quite diametrically opposed views. And they're reasonable because it's not just ideology often that leads them to take these different views. It's different views of what the evidence says, what we think are the merits of the sort of economic arguments, the political arguments, or whatever. And politicians will therefore try and persuade us and many others out in the rest of the world of the merits of their particular argument. So we thought it would be an interesting thing to see, could we invite some people on our behalf, as it were, to make those arguments as strongly as they can in both directions. So today we've asked Bryce Wilkinson and Bill Rosenberg to present the 2 cases, as it were, for and against today's debate, which, as you can see behind me, is a debate over the proposition that a 0% cap on real per capita government expenditure growth would be a sensible objective for New Zealand. I should stress a couple of things before I invite them to open up this debate or lead us in this debate. One is we've asked them deliberately, as I said, to present strongly as they can the case that they're going to make. You shouldn't interpret what they say, therefore, necessarily as their opinion. They've kindly agreed to make the case. They maybe had to work harder to avoid, in fact, expressing personal opinion. Second thing I'll say is that we are going to operate Chatham House rules here today, which Chatham House rule implies that you may quote what was said verbatim if necessary, but you may not attribute it to the person who said it. Now, that seems a little odd when we've got 3 people who it's perfectly obvious who they are. It would be very hard to record what they said without saying who said it. So what we mean in this case is that before you make any reference to what any of the speakers here say, you would need to check it with them. So if there are some journalists in the audience, if you want to report what they said, it needs to go to them first, please, before you make it public. So that's probably enough from me. You've seen the outline of the other debates. We hope that we'll see you in subsequent debates. But today, Bryce Wilkinson, I'm sure many of you will know, been around the Wellington policy scene for a long time, but Bryce is the CEO of Capital Economics in New Zealand, and he's a former Director of the Treasury, so he's well familiar with public expenditure issues. And I'm sure many of you are aware, he's made written and oral contributions in numerous forums to issues of public policy, and I know this is a subject that's quite dear to his heart. Bill is an economist and director of the Council of Trade Unions, and Bill has also contributed regularly. When I used to attend and organise Treasury guest lectures, Bill was always a regular attendee and helpful contributor, so I'm pleased that he's been willing to pick up the baton and try and present the opposing case in this debate. And Anne-Marie Brook is Principal Advisor in the Macroeconomic and Fiscal Policy team in the Treasury. And actually that team, as you may know, if you've seen the working paper that came out of Treasury, I think it was a couple of years ago, on a spending cap, that team was responsible for the drafting of that working paper, so I'm sure Anne-Marie is well familiar with the arguments and evidence around these issues. And the last thing I'll say before we move on is this is not a debate, explicitly not a debate, about the ACT National Confidence and Supply Agreement, which included reference to caps on public spending. So what we'd like the debate to do is to focus on the key issues, the general issues, and how they may be applied. But it's not about the merits of any particular political party's choices or preferences. So I shall, without further ado, pass you on to Bryce, who's going to make the case in favour of the proposition.
Great. Okay, thank you very much for attending, ladies and gentlemen. It's the first of the debate series, and Bill and I have sort of agreed to do our bit to try and make it entertaining and worth your coming, and I really appreciate that you've done your bit and come here. Let's see if we can make it work together. With respect to Norman's introductory remarks, it hardly needs to be said that on this particular topic, it's public knowledge that what I'm speaking is what I think, and also because I published sort of recommending this bill in 2004, or a bill like this, the one being debated. So it is my views being expressed, and I'm not going to try and exaggerate them for the purposes of the debate. You'll see that there are qualifications to my position. So to business. Firstly, well, community wellbeing is obviously harmed if governments don't fail to spend wisely and well, and the same for taxes. And fiscal rules are necessary and have always existed. Charles I sort of lost his head in a debate over fiscal rules and who should be in charge of them. And we've seen many civil wars since, and we'll see many more again in future. The question really for us today is what have we learned about what rules work the best? And as Norman says, there's plenty of scope for debate about that. New Zealand used to have, of course, and still does have, the Cabinet Manual, and it used to have Byzantine Treasury instructions of incredible detail, many of which were lost in the antiquity of time. And even Treasury didn't have a complete set of its instructions. That all got cleaned out, but it didn't stop. It just raised the question of what should be done in place of a more general nature. All those Byzantine rules and controls and constraints through the 20th century didn't stop enormous spending blowouts from time to time and debt crises. The big one, which started with the oil shock in 1973-4, led to deficit spending continuously right through to about 1988, and the debt crisis accompanied that was the one which stimulated the development of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. The Fiscal Responsibility Act is widely regarded as a success. I myself not quite that convinced. I'm regarding it as having its first test at the currently, when we've had another sort of spending blowout and we're seeing deficits for as long as the eye can see until rosy scenarios kicks in and eliminates them. But let's see if that's going to happen. So I think it's got its real test, but it is not a spending rule. It's not what we're discussing today. It's not concerned with the quantum of spending or in taxes or with the quality of them. It's not concerned with community well-being in that wider sense, or what wasteful spending is doing to the prosperity of New Zealanders and their ability to afford things which they want to buy, like better health, education, cleaner environment, or whatever. It's their choice. So 30 years after the Fiscal Responsibility Act, we're 30 years, roughly, we're seeing, we saw Core Crown operating spending blowing out by 5% of GDP to reach 35%, and net Core Crown debt doubling to 20% of GDP and expected to rise further. Well, this isn't about opposing all government spending at all. No one's opposed to government spending which raises community well-being. Governments can let the community down by failing to spend wisely when they should be. And I think one strong evidence of pathology in the last decade of that nature was when we saw a cut-off benefit-to-cost ratio for spending on roads of $4 a benefit for $1 of cost at a 10% discount rate. And that's a clear sign that something's terribly wrong. Either not enough has been spent, or else the calculations are so badly wrong that they're not useful. On the other hand, wasteful government spending in New Zealand is enormous, as one would expect, given the failure for many decades to subject around 95% of annual government spending to rigorous and systematic scrutiny. The very fact that it's not been rigorously evaluated is proof that that's not a priority. Flagrant examples are easy to list. You know, Muldoon's 75 superannuation policy, the promises that DPB and interest-free student loans wouldn't lead to big behavioural responses which lead to major unjustified spending increases, the extraordinary think big losses, which on my calculation are comparable relative to GDP then of 45 billion to the Christchurch earthquake today, but the big difference is that overseas insurers are going to pay for a big chunk of the Christchurch earthquake, whereas the think big losses nearly all came out as an increase in external public debt owed overseas. The overpayment of toll for New Zealand Rail was another recent one. An extraordinary one, I thought, was $1 billion lost on the government guarantee for finance companies. The critical decision there not being the one to offer a government guarantee, but to make an unpriced offer, not to charge a premium which was commensurate with the actuarial risk being taken on. And that was an extraordinary expenditure decision, not subject to parliamentary scrutiny, never evaluated and justified through normal processes. General elections are commonly a time when the beast manifests itself in the most visible way. Winston Peters' condition for becoming a Deputy Prime Minister and Treasury in 1996 for a $6 billion increase in spending. You know, the spending proposal never subject to public sector scrutiny or not. Michael Cullen's 2004 budget, which increased spending by $14 billion over 3 years, just because the money was there to spend. Those material spending promises are just sort of the tip of the iceberg. It's general elections, you see what's actually happening. Spending has been promised to appeal to particular constituencies without a proper evaluation. When the successful party is elected, the evaluation's still not generally done. Why? Because it would be career limiting for a public servant to do it at that point. Secondly, under the OIA, it would be embarrassing for the government if a country one came out. So these things just don't happen. What's the overall story behind this when you put it all together? Well, in preparing for this debate, I've looked back at 100 years. In the last 100 years to 2010, taxes per capita have increased 20-fold in real per capita terms, taking inflation out. Income per capita went up about 4-fold. So, and when you look through the history of when and how it happened,